moderator. We're very privileged to have with us two distinguished guests. History, as we've heard in the last couple of months in Japan, is always a very live issue in this country. It keeps coming up again and again. Our two guests today are dealing with history and with an alternative view of history. Oliver Stone, of course, is a movie director. He's one of the most consistently provocative and interesting movie directors to come out of America in the last quarter century. He made his mark with a series of cultural landmarks that have provoked admiration, and I think he won't disagree, controversy over the last 25 years, sometimes in equal measures. His first major feature is Salvador, which a lot of people haven't seen, which is a wonderful movie, and Platoon, were very angry indictments of American foreign policy. In Wall Street, he caught the zeitgeist of Reaganite America, perhaps better than any other director working at the time. In 1994, his film Natural Born Killers triggered a debate on movie violence and so on. His longtime collaborator is Peter Kuznick. He's director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University in Washington, D.C. He's a professor of history. The Institute aims to educate students as well as the general public about the key points of nuclear history and nuclear culture in the United States, and of course on the legitimacy of using the nuclear weapon, nuclear bomb, not only using it but deploying it, most famously, of course, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Peter is a scholar of the roots of American empire and the growth of the secret state, and he seeks to debunk the myth of American exceptionalism. They're in Japan to promote a book and, of course, a documentary series. Oliver Stone's 10-part Untold history of the U.S. has been described as riveting, provocative, and a revelation. And again, I don't think he'll disagree if conservatives have described it as mendacious Cold War revisionism and mindless Stalinist propaganda. That's one of my favorite phrases, mindless Stalinist propaganda. I can barely get it out in one word. It's been run on the US cable and satellite network Showtime since last year. It's been repeated, and it's about to be screened in Japan. So I think they're both going to talk for 10 minutes each. There's the book, by the way, right here in Japanese. They're going to talk. Oliver's going to talk first, Peter second, and can I remind you that we're sort of making mini history today because this is the first time we're live streaming on the FCCJ website. So it's available if you go to the FCCJ website and click on the link. You can see it. I should also introduce my colleague over there, Lucy Birmingham, the president of the club. Oliver, whenever you're ready.
Yeah. In my thank you for having us. We're glad to be here and honored by your presence. To make an overview, and we'll turn this over for questions and we'll get more specific, but to give you a brief overview of how this thing got started and how I got started, because I tie into this. I was born in '46, a year after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and I grew up conservative. My father was a Republican, a stockbroker. He was on the staff of Eisenhower's in World War II. And I grew up in New York City, and I saw the world through New York City eyes. Post-war, it was the place to be. I went to schools, good schools, and I served in Vietnam in 1967-8. I came through Tokyo in '65 as a teacher in Vietnam. I consulted all the old Tokyo hands on Asia. Everyone was very deeply worried about the communist threat. Not only in Vietnam, but coming towards Tokyo. Tokyo was the capital of the domino principle. That was where, if Vietnam fell, Thailand, and so forth and so on, Philippines, it would come here to Tokyo. Japan was the objective to hold on to. I say that just in passing because it'll come back to bear later. I fought in the war, and I didn't really, although it was, I've documented it. At the time, I was really more like a survivor. Numbed out, alienated, came back to my country, found my way back into society. It took some time. But essentially, I went to film school. I was very lucky. I got to film school at the right time, and I learned how to make films and struggled through the 70s. And as the 70s was going on, my evolution occurred there in sense of people talking to me, telling me things, experience, reading. There was, of course, the Watergate scandal and then the famous Church Committee hearings in 1975, which really affected me deeply because, you know, it was about our government lying to its citizens on a constant basis. It was very upsetting, and I think, although it's the tip of the iceberg now, we realize at that time it was quite something. And that's why every little bit counts, every little inch counts when you can uncover a story, even if it doesn't seem so at the time. But it really affected me. And I remember the FISA court in 1977, they passed that legislation, and that was supposed to be a corrective to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. That was supposed to be a way of reforming the system of intervention, CIA, dirty secrets, intervening in foreign countries, and so forth. By 1980s, I wasn't totally convinced that the United States was up to no good. I actually went to Central America with Richard Boyle, and from there I saw that this was with my own hands, my own eyes, I saw Nicaragua, I saw Guatemala, and I saw Salvador, and Honduras too. And I saw U.S. troops in many of these places starting to come in. I saw the influence, the CIA, and I realized that this was Vietnam Redux. This was going to happen again. Reagan, had he not been derailed, was planning a war in Nicaragua. He was going to stop the commies from getting across the Rio Grande. So this was when I made the film Salvador, which David kindly mentioned in 1985-6, I was on a path that was a new path for me. It was to try to make progressive films that made a difference, trying to point the finger at things that no other U.S. Filmmakers were really pointing at. It was coming from Europe, the criticism on Vietnam, but it wasn't really severe. Yes, it was in the U.S., but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. And I made Salvador. It failed at the box office, but it succeeded, and I had some luck, and I was able to make Platoon, which had enormous success. And then from Platoon on, I continued to try to make progressive films. And I made quite a few and had a lot of controversy, as David has said. It taught me a lot about the way the U.S. sees itself, the media sees the U.S. By 2008, I was almost 62 years old, I guess, 61 years old. I decided after 8 years of George Bush that I could not go on just making a feature film. I said, this is insane. This is an insane situation. I knew Peter since 1995. He'd been a teacher at American University. He'd had me there. He was teaching a class in my films, actually. And we had a relationship that went on for 12 years. But by 2008, I went to him. I said, let's try to do something about this. Let's do a documentary about at least the atomic bomb and how this thing came about and what it meant to the United States foreign life. I mean, to the United States in general. It grew quickly from a 1.5-hour documentary to a 12-hour documentary that we did over the next 5 years. We didn't know it then, but we were in for it. It was the most difficult, perhaps, film of my life to make, and it took the most amount of time and energy. We released it in 2012 on Showtime, almost 5 years after we'd started it. And in it, of course, the first 3 chapters are devoted to World War II and the atomic bomb here in Japan. And in that atomic bombing, we find everything that's wrong with the United States today. We find the lying, the official denial, the censorship, obviously, I think many of you know, and probably some of you probably may not agree with us, but the predominant myth was the United States had to drop those bombs to win World War II, that the Japanese would have resisted, they were fanatics, and that there would be Okinawas and Iwo Jimas until the very end, and the bomb saved, according to various estimates, hundreds of thousands of American lives. Now, this is all lies, and we go into some depth to reveal this in the series and in the book in more depth. I urge you, if you haven't read it, to please read it. What is relevant to us is that Japan was seeking to surrender very actively. It was using the Soviets to try to, diplomatically, to try to reach out to us. And they were most astounded when the Soviets invaded on August 9th, when they invaded Japan, and they cut off forever the diplomatic lifeline that Japan had. It was the Soviet invasion. We have talked to many of the Japanese survivors of those blasts, the hibakusha, and they have told us that they didn't know anything what the A-bomb was. They'd been bombed all that spring, all that year. They were exhausted, famished. The economy was breaking down. But what they did know was that the news was the Soviets invaded. That made the news. The atomic bomb was just another bomb to them. After the firebombing of Tokyo, it doesn't even compare to some of them. Anyway, the Soviet invasion was very important, and when we look at American history books, it is mentioned briefly in a compartmentalized way that it doesn't make sense. So you have to understand the Potsdam position. You have to understand what Truman was thinking and what he knew about the Soviet invasion. He wanted the Soviet invasion when he went to Potsdam. He was all for it. Roosevelt certainly wanted it. It would end the war without American involvement. And it would have ended the war because, frankly, the Soviets wiped out the Kwangtung army. They demolished the 1 million man Kwangtung army in a matter of days in Manchuria. In a matter of days. This was the strongest army Japan had left. It would have been conceivably very little time for the Soviets to reach into Japan itself and take Hokkaido, and this was a big concern of the Japanese War Cabinet. They were terrified and stunned by this invasion. And within a few days, of course, the emperor surrendered, and Soviet Union was effectively cut out of the Japan as a post-war basis for Soviets to operate. And this is what the United States wanted. The Soviets were cut out of the decision-making in the Far East. The United States took control of Japan completely, censored the atomic bombs, and the rest it becomes dirtier and dirtier as the United States uses Japan to fight communism in the Far East, which is what I alluded to on Vietnam. And here we are in Japan now in 2013. It seems like we live too long sometimes. And the story goes on and on and on. And as I've said to the Japanese media, into their face, it seems you people you are like the United States people. You don't know your own history. It's untold. It's unlearned. You went through World War II, and unlike the German people, who at least were re-educated forcibly in Germany, the Germans had an understanding of what happened with Hitler. I don't find that to be true here, except among the more educated Japanese or the more liberal Japanese. There's just no knowledge of it. It's astounding to me. But when I go back to the United States, how can we hold our hand and consider ourselves superior when my own daughter, at 17 years old in a good school in Los Angeles, doesn't really understand what happened in World War II? The myth is the United States. The myth is we ended World War II with the atomic bomb. The truth is we trashed the memory of all the sacrifice that went into World War II from both the Soviet and U.S. sides by resorting to the bomb to end it. It ends it on a dirty note. It sends the wrong message to the world. It sends terror to the world, whereas truly it was a great victory for many men who died and women. And this is a sense I find from history, a sense of injustice and anger about this, and it motivates me surprisingly at the age of 66 today that I'm still angry about the way we tell our history to our kids, in both countries. And on that note, my 12 minutes are up, 13 minutes. Thank you for listening to me. I'll turn it over to Peter.
Oliver and I share a passionate concern about the importance of history. We agree with Orwell and others who said that he who controls the past controls the present, and he who controls the present controls the future. We think that understanding of the past is actually worth fighting for. Every person has his or her own interpretation of history. Some people it's conscious, for most people it's not very conscious, but they act in the world based on an understanding of history. Unfortunately, that understanding is often confused or flat out wrong. In the United States, in 2011, was issued what was called America's Report Card. Based on that, the American high school seniors were weakest in U.S. history. We sometimes bemoan the fact that our students are so weak in math and science. According to the National Report Card, they're weaker in U.S. history. Of those surveyed, 12% were viewed to be proficient in U.S. history. 12% proficient, not outstanding, but proficient, barely competent. Of those 12%, only 2% could identify the issue that was addressed by Brown versus Board of Education, even though that was implicit in the way the question was asked. So we're dealing with two problems. One is historical amnesia or lack of knowledge. And the second is that to the extent that students in the United States and the public knows history, they've got it wrong. And we look, that's why we began our documentary series with World War II. Because the fundamental myths that guide the post-war period take root in our understanding of World War II. We trace it back earlier in the book and in the documentaries we're putting out, but World War II is central to this. The three basic myths that come out of World War II for the United States. One is that the United States won the war in Europe. The reality for anybody who studied that is that the Soviet Union won the war in Europe. Throughout most of that war, the Americans and the British faced 10 German divisions combined, while the Soviets were facing 200 German divisions. Churchill says it was the Soviet army that tore the guts out of the Nazis. Churchill admits that. The Soviets lost 27 million in World War II. The Americans and the British around 300,000. In order to take the pressure off the Soviet Union, Roosevelt promised publicly in mid-1942 to open up a second front in Europe before the end of 1942. Roosevelt wanted to. Marshall wanted to. Eisenhower wanted to. Churchill said no. And so instead, the United States went chasing British imperial interests in Northern Africa, in the Mediterranean, throughout that region, while the Soviets were dying. And the Soviets won that war. That's myth number one. Myth number two that Oliver was just talking about is the atomic bombing. The American students are taught that this was a heroic act, necessary, the good thing to end the war, to save American lives, or else we would have lost 500,000 Truman rights in an invasion. Oliver says there's no truth to that, but Americans mostly don't know that. After the bomb was dropped, 85% of the American public said they thought it was a good thing. 23% said they wished the Japanese had not surrendered so quickly so we could have dropped more atomic bombs on them. There was such a hatred toward the Japanese. And the history gets covered up. The official narratives come out, and they tell the story. The reality, as Oliver was saying, was that the United States had already been firebombing Japanese cities, over 100 Japanese cities. We'd proven to the Japanese leaders that we could wipe out Japanese cities. 99.5% of the city of Toyama. Secretary of War Henry Stimson says to Truman, I don't want the United States to get the reputation of outdoing Hitler in atrocities with our firebombing. So that's not what changed it, the atomic bombs. We'd been already wiping out cities. What changed it, as Oliver said, was the Soviet invasion, because that undermined the Japanese diplomatic strategy, and it undermined their military strategy, their Ketsugo strategy. So the whole strategy was bankrupt, and the war ends, but the United States spreads these myths about what really was happening. Because we pose the question, how would the world now look at nuclear weapons if it was Germany that dropped the first bombs, not the United States? The world would have recoiled in horror at the brutality and inhumanity of the Nazis for dropping atomic bombs and wiping out cities. And we should recoil in horror. But because it was the United States, the victors in the war, and it tied into the fundamental myth, was the myth of American exceptionalism. This has guided American policy really from the founding aboard the Arbella, when Jonathan Winthrop says in 1630 that we shall be as a city upon the hill, we will be the moral guide to the rest of the universe. But it comes out more clearly after World War II, this idea of American benevolence, the myth of American exceptionalism, that other countries are greedy, self-interested, territorial aggrandizing, pushing for their own power, but the United States is different. The United States is benevolent, altruistic, generous. We just want to spread freedom and democracy. That's such a, well, obviously you know that, what a myth that is. And George Kennan, who was the architect of America's Cold War policy, the containment policy, which we're now adjusting toward China, Kennan says in 1948 that the United States has 6.3% of the world population, but we control 50% of the world's wealth. Our goal in the future period has got to be to figure out a way to maintain that disparity. He says we can't get caught up in sentimentalism. We can't talk about freedom and human rights. So that's not what it's about. It's about maintaining America's power and American influence and this disparity in wealth. And the United States goes off on that direction. The third myth, then, is the origins of the Cold War. In the United States, we taught that the United States was simply responding to Soviet aggression, that the Soviets wanted to expand into Europe, that the Soviets wanted ports, that the Soviets wanted territory. What we show in Untold History is that that is not what happened, that Franklin Roosevelt had a vision for the post-war world, that this vice president before Truman, Henry Wallace, had the greatest vision for the post-war world, a world of collaboration, friendship, ending imperialism and colonialism, ending exploitation, the U.S. and the Soviets working together to spread a very different message of peace. Truman gets in there. Truman had said in 1941, he said, if the Germans are winning, we should support the Russians, and if the Russians are winning, we should support the Germans, and that way let them kill as many of each other as possible. He gets in there and he's got that same mindset. And so within 2 weeks, Truman takes office April 12th. By the time that the Americans meet with Molotov on April 23rd, U.S. policy has flipped 180 degrees. Now the Soviets are being viewed as our enemy. Now the Soviets are being accused of breaking their agreements. We later backed off and said, well, actually, they had the right interpretation, and we didn't. But the mistrust follows at that point. And then the atomic bomb feeds into that, because the Soviets knew better than anybody how devastated the Japanese were, because Japan was trying to get the Soviets to negotiate to get Japan better surrender terms. So how did the Soviets interpret the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? They said this bomb is being dropped on us, that we are the real targets because Japan is already defeated. And they were right. And Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, says, I had no illusions. From the time I took over this project, I knew that Russia was really our enemy, and the project was directed in that way. And so we focus on this because what we're trying to show is the pattern. And the pattern continues. We see not a straight line, fortunately, it's a curved line, because there are attempts to change that. There are opportunities to change that. 1953, March 5th, Stalin dies. The Soviet leaders hand out an olive branch to the United States, asking basically to end the Cold War. What does the United States do? We repudiate that. We vastly increase our nuclear arsenal and our expansion and bases and strength around the world. 1962, we had another opportunity after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy learned the lesson. Kennedy and Khrushchev both said, we can work together to change the world. Let's end the Cold War. They both wanted to. Said, let's get rid of every possible conflict that can lead to another confrontation like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they were doing that. And Kennedy gets assassinated. Oliver made a brilliant movie about the Kennedy assassination, which raises a lot of the issues that we're getting at. So Wallace was destroyed in 1945, 46, Kennedy in 1962, but there's going to be time after time with Carter's election, there's going to be with the end of the Cold War, instead of the United States reaching out to Russia in 1991, we praised Russia for Gorbachev for not going into Eastern Europe with troops. What do? We invade Panama. We invade Kuwait. We spread the empire. We undermine the Soviet economy. The American advisors go in there, and within a few years, the Soviet standard of living has dropped 90% based on America's shock therapy that we offered the Soviet economy. We had hope again with the election of Obama. Our hopes, of course, were very, very, very badly disappointed, as we can see now. We can talk about in the question and answer. Now Obama's Asia pivot is the same kind of unfortunate, misguided policy. So what we're trying to show are the patterns that exist from the 1890s through the World War II, the post-war period, right up to the present. And if you take the broad view, as we're trying to do, and you see those patterns, you understand why Obama has gone along, in part, with so much of the Bush administration policies. As Ari Fleischer, Bush's press secretary, said recently, this is the fourth term of the Bush administration. But that what we see now is not Obama challenging empire, Obama running it more efficiently. Obama putting into place, institutionalizing the policies that George Bush and Cheney introduced, but were considered to be so outrageous. Now under Obama, they're given a human face and an intelligent explanation on occasion, and they're being institutionalized. In some ways, this is more dangerous than the cowboy-crazy policies of the Bush administration. So thanks for coming, and we're happy to talk and answer your questions.
Thank you for those speeches. Okay, we're going to take questions from the working press first, which is these three tables here, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience. Can I remind you, when you come to the microphone, can you give your name and the name of your organization, and can you avoid speechifying if possible? Oliver's just said he's completely wrecked after 12 days of this, so no questions about Michael Jackson's, Michael Douglas's sex life, for example. I see Khaldoon's hand first.
Okay. Something happened?
Did Michael Jackson have a sex life?
Thank you. Please talk about it later. Khaldoon Azhari, Panorama News. My question is about Japan. So now America was leading lies about nuclear weapons. So what Japan should do now, because they use American nuclear umbrella to protect themselves. Do you think the Tokyo turbine or the Tokyo court after the World War II should be reviewed and should be a new system from now on? Thank you.
Sorry, Khaldoon, he wants to know where you're from.
Syria, originally.
Syria.
Yes,
Wow.
thank you.
Why don't you take that one? Not too long.
Yeah, we're glad to say that a Syrian publisher has just contracted to put out an Arabic version of the Untold history. So we're looking forward to that.
Plug yourself too.
Plugging you. The U.S.-Japan relationship is problematic. This goes way back to the post-World War II period when the United States occupied Japan and censored the Japanese press. This is why the kind of effort that we see here today is so important, because we saw what happened during censorship. During that period, the Japanese were not allowed to even talk or write or have symposiums on the atomic bomb. There was a period of very, very harsh censorship that lasted till 1952. But the Americans have treated Japan largely as our errand boys ever since, as our junior partners in spreading the empire. And so the United States in 1960, with the re-upping of AMPO under Kishi, that family is very important to Japan's not telling the history about its own, the truth about its own history. Because you had Kishi in 1960, then you had Sato, his brother, in 1972, with the reversion of Okinawa. And when Okinawa reverts back to Japan, he announces the 3 non-nuclear principles, but he cuts a secret deal with the United States to allow the introduction of nuclear weapons into Okinawa. And then you follow that straight through to Abe, to Kishi's grandson. And Abe is one of the worst deniers of real history. It's the kind of thing that we're fighting against. We're fighting against people because it's a universal pattern. And it's not just the victors, sometimes it's the victims, the losers, who also deny their history. Much of Asia now doesn't want to tell the real history about Japanese occupation because they want Japanese tourists. But Abe, it's one of the things we've seen. On the one hand, the issues that get discussed are the comfort women and the Nanjing massacre. There's some discussion of that. There's very little discussion of what else happened during the Japanese occupation and Japanese empire when the Japanese go into Burma and Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore and Vietnam and what they do throughout that region. With the comfort women, we see the comfort women issue being talked about in terms of Korean. That was happening all over Asia under the Japanese occupation. A much worse story, a much uglier story than is taught in Japan or elsewhere. So we think that it's essential to hold the mirror up and put a spotlight on every country's untold history, the things that allow the kinds of policies you're talking about to continue. The nuclear umbrella. Japan should be leading the fight to get rid of nuclear weapons. Japan is the only country to have been attacked with nuclear bombs in warfare. Japan has Article 9 in its constitution. That should be a model for the entire world. Instead, Japan undermines the meaning of Article 9 already. Japan has the fourth biggest defense budget in the world. And Japan cowers like a scared child under America's nuclear umbrella. The Japanese should be standing up for independence, for truth, and for resolving these conflicts in a peaceful way, rather than the threat of America's nuclear arms backing you up. It's like some kid who goes out there and picks fights, and then he's got his big brother behind him to go clean up after him. And that doesn't make sense. We want to see we want to see Japan play a leading role in making this a more peaceful world and resolving the conflicts in the Pacific, which some are real conflicts, in a way that shows the vision of Japan, the fact that Japan has a peace constitution and a commitment to non-nuclear resolution rather than the nuclear umbrella.
Oliver, did you want to say something?
No.
No? Next question? You all right? Okay. This lady here. Does anybody have their hand down? Does anybody have their hand on the back? Because I can't see it with these lights.
These lights.
Peter.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Nancy Snow. I'm with the Huffington Post. I've also written for 20 years about American propaganda. I haven't yet had the pleasure of reading your series, but do you all address this in the context of propaganda? And Edward R. Murrow said 50 years ago when he headed USIA, truth is the best propaganda. And I think that's what you're getting at here. But how do you awaken people to wanting to go back and learn this history that's so crucial? Thank you.
Oh, well, from my point of view, I come at this as a dramatist, and he comes at it as a historian. We cross-fertilized for these 5 years. I mean, the best way is to tell an exciting story. And I think that's what we've done. I think this documentary is the fastest documentary with the most amount of information I've seen. There's no talking heads. There's no stopping. There's no reaffirming. I think it's great filmmaking. That's, of course, me talking about it, because I take all the techniques from JFK, and I've used them in this film. We also use movie clips, and I think wonderful music. But it's essentially a movie-going experience that can be watched in the theater, and we've shown it in theaters. I'm going to San Sebastian next month, the Spanish festival, to show all 12 hours. We have 12 hours coming out on DVD, which is very important for us on the whole series, because no one saw the World War I section as well as the 1930s section, which explains a lot of the background of World War II. That's coming out on October 22 from Warner Brothers. And we also have a paperback, as well as a mid-levels more for younger readers is going to be made, as well as a comic is in the works, like Howard Zinn had a comic. So we're trying to get this out there. We're selling in foreign countries. We've sold Japan, but Korea we haven't sold. So there's constant, it's an uphill battle. The mainstream press in the United States was not very kind to us. They ignored us. But we did get great the progressive press was really very supportive. So, but mainstream press, the Time magazines, the New York Times, forget about it, It's really sad, and you're right about the ghost of Edward R. Murrow. We need Edward R. Murrow. Where is he now? I mean, he's in our documentary. He's interviewing Truman, by the way, and he gets some of the best stuff ever from Truman. You see Truman's attitude about, when Truman says to Murrow, I never lost a night's sleep over it. It's just heartbreaking that Truman is incapable of any empathy for the victims, or empathy for anybody, for that matter, except for his cronies. Excitement, danger, tell it true. People are a sucker for the truths. So if the problem with U.S. history, in my opinion, is that it's sanitized. It's like a Disney movie. So I don't think the kids are responding. And he quoted the poll figures are very low. I don't think kids they know it. They know that U.S. history is crooked. They know that the United States always comes out ahead. And generally, it's rigged that way, and it looks good. And there's none of that questioning about the moral imagination of the United States, what was lacking in Truman. My daughter, her school book, it's very compartmentalized. You will have criticism of the Vietnam War. Yes, they're much better on the Vietnam War than they used to be. But it goes into the Vietnam War, but it doesn't go into the Korean War in depth, and it doesn't go into Reagan. It doesn't go into Bush. Father going into Kuwait, which is a very important story because that's the end of the Cold War. And we go, instead of committing to peace, we go into Kuwait. That's a very important, and that's overlooked in our history. And it doesn't go into Reagan. Now, Reagan, of course, is a divisive issue, even in the United States, but we do find in the school books that Reagan is given too much benefit of the doubt, and we don't raise enough questions about what he was doing in Afghanistan and how much Reagan has to do with the birth of Al-Qaeda and all this extremism, fundamentalism, and how crazy Bill Casey was, how crazy Reagan's view of the world is. We don't get that in American history. We're putting up statues to him in Washington, right? There's a Ronald Reagan Airport right now. That's pretty sad, as well as a Dulles building. So I think Alan Dulles, is it Alan Dulles?
And John Foster.
And John Foster. These people are getting by. They're being exonerated by our American history.
I'm going to add a couple of things. You talked about propaganda. You said you've been fighting against propaganda for 20 years. Great. Keep up that fight. That's what we need. Especially journalists. Journalists are on the front line there. I.F. Stone, the great independent journalist, used to go around to bodies of journalism schools, and he'd tell the students, if you want to be a journalist, there are 2 words you have to remember: governments lie. And one time he added, and the Americans are the only ones who smoke the same hashish they pass out. So very often American journalists believe their own propaganda. And they're key, plus television, plus the schools, plus the textbooks, as Oliver says. Oliver said that the treatment of Vietnam is improving. I hope that's true, but we don't see a lot of evidence. We're very concerned. A recent poll showed that 51% of American youth between the ages of 18 and 29 say Vietnam was not a mistake. 51%. This is astounding to us. It was 70% of those over 60, but 51% of the younger kids. That just shows us we're losing the fight in some ways. We're fighting for memory. For us, it's all about history. It's all about memory. It's all about the past. Vietnam, Oliver fought in Vietnam. I fought against Vietnam. He was highly decorated and wounded twice. I got wounded in a number of battles with police during that time because I was very active in the anti-war movement. So we came to this from different sides, but we met in the middle in terms of our views. But Vietnam is central to both of us. And the fact that Americans are losing their understanding of the history of Vietnam bothers us deeply. When Robert McNamara, I often ask my student, how many Vietnamese died in the war? And I usually get 100,000, maybe 500,000. The ones who really know something say 1 million. Robert McNamara came into my class, who was the brains behind the war, and he said that he believes that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war. I asked that question, because how would we feel if the average German youth thought that 500,000 Jews died in the Holocaust? I asked my students, how many Jews died in the Holocaust? Every hand goes up, 6 million. They all know that. They think 500,000 Vietnamese died at the hands of their own government, but 6 million Jews died, they know, at the hands of the Nazis. To me, that's very troubling. It's troubling that Americans learn some of this, occasionally the history of other people's atrocities, but they don't learn the history of their own atrocities. The Vietnam Memorial is very powerful. I'm sure most of you have seen it. What it lists is the names of 58,252 Americans who died. The message is that the tragedy of Vietnam was that 58,252 Americans died. What we're calling for is a memorial that lists the names of 58,252 Americans, 3.8 million Vietnamese, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians, Laotians, and other people. That's a memorial that says something. Talks about the tragedy, and it's not just a tragedy, it's a crime. The Americans, we talk about the war in Vietnam. We always talk about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but this is the war in Vietnam. It's sanitized language. It's a battle over language, which Huxley understood, Orwell understood. A lot of it is about language. We don't call it the American invasion of Vietnam. If we called it that, and we talked about the atrocities, and we talked about the deaths, then maybe 51% of young people would not think that the Vietnam War was justifiable. But this is the way Oliver and I are trying to fight for an uncorrupted view of history, because we think it's so central to how people understand what the United States and the rest of the world is doing now and will do in the future.
Well, additional comment. I just would like to say how struck I was in Nagasaki by two things. One was the museum of atrocities the Japanese have committed.